right, so now that we know the lingo that we need to understand these genetic crosses, let's look at Mendel's experiments and how he discovered these three fundamental rules or laws of modern day genetics. So firstly, Mendel would cross a true breeding tall plant with true breeding dwarf plants. Keep in mind, true breeding, again, means if it's allowed to self-pollinate, it will make identical copies of itself. So, true breeding tall crossed with a true breeding dwarf. This is how we would write that. And then Mendel got all tall offspring. Now, to you and I, that tells us right away that the tall allele for height is dominant over the dwarf allele for height. And the way we would write this is the F1 hybrids were all tall. Again, remember, F1 is the first generation produced by the P generation, the parents, and then hybrid referring to an offspring from parents with different traits, which all of these offspring were. And all the offspring, again, notice had only one appearance from one parent. The trait of the other parent, it kind of seems to have almost disappeared. Mendel actually thought that the dwarf trait had been lost somewhere throughout the process of fertilization and pollination, cross-pollination. So, Mendel's two conclusions from this. Mendel realized that biological inheritance is determined by factors. Remember, Mendel didn't know about DNA. He didn't know that genes made up DNA, and he called them factors. He's determined that these factors are passed from one generation to the next, from parent to offspring. And today, obviously, we know these factors to be genes. Each of the traits that Mendel observed in the pea plants was controlled by only one gene that occurred in two contrasting forms, right? So, for instance, the gene for height, its two alleles, its two variations were tall and dwarf. Okay, now this is where Mendel got lucky, because there are traits, I should say, controlled by more than one gene, and they come in more than two contrasting forms. So this is where Mendel got really lucky in building his foundation of modern day genetics, by picking these traits that just so happened to be one gene with two forms, as simple as it gets when it comes to genetics. And here's an example. The gene for height in pea plants occurs in the tall form and in the dwarf form, and again, we call the different forms of a gene alleles. Okay, so Mendel realized that some alleles are dominant over others. Hence, in his first cross of true breeding tall plants with true breeding short plants or dwarf plants, all of the offspring were tall. This implies that the tall allele is dominant to the dwarf allele. And this is where Mendel would begin to lay the foundation for his first law, the principle of dominance and recessiveness. So some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. A dominant allele can actually mask a recessive allele, giving it the appearance that it's not even there and that you do not contain that gene or that allele within your genome. So the definition of a dominant allele is if the dominant allele is present, the dominant trait will show up in the offspring. The recessive allele, this trait will only show up if the dominant allele is not present. Okay, so the recessive allele relies on the dominant allele not being present. The dominant allele will show up no matter what if it is present in the DNA. And these are just in this image, these are the traits that Mendel looked at. He looked at seed shape, color, seed coat color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and plant height. All of these are genes within the pea plant all these are traits within the pea plant controlled by one gene that comes in two contrasting forms. Okay, but Mendel had a question, and I think it's the question we probably all had at first was, had the dwarf trait, this recessive allele, disappeared, or did those F1 offspring still have it, even though they all had the appearance of being tall? And just an FYI, when we talk about the appearance of a trait, being tall or dwarf. We call that an organism's phenotype. So the appearance, the physical representation of genes and or alleles is a phenotype, which you'll hear me say more and more. So Mendel allowed, to figure out where this recessive allele had gone, he allowed the F1 offspring, or you can also refer to them as all the hybrid tall offspring, to self-pollinate. Okay, this is a great idea, right? If we let these F1 offspring, these hybrid tall offspring self-pollinate, we know that self-pollination, if the plant is true breeding, should produce identical copies. So all the offspring should be tall. And that would be the case if the recessive dwarf allele was gone, if we lost it in fertilization. So we can write the self-pollination like this: cross the F1 tall with another F1 tall. This is technically the same plant, right? Because self-pollination is when the sperm of one plant fertilizes the egg of the same plant. And the resulting plants were 3/4 tall and 1 short. So the offspring were 3/4 tall and 1 dwarf. The dwarf allele has reappeared in the second generation after not being seen since the parental generation, the P generation. This is often the pattern for recessive traits. So he found that 3/4 of the offspring were tall, 3/4 were dwarf, and evidently to him, the F1 tall offspring were carriers of the dwarf trait, but it had been hidden, masked, because it's recessive, by the dominant tall allele. So the takeaway here is the dwarf trait, this recessive allele, had not been lost, but rather it was passed down to the offsprings and would reappear in the F2 generation, the generation that Mendel created, allowing the F1 generation to self-pollinate. Keep in mind, these P generation plants, this tall and this short one, this dwarf one, they're true breeding. If they're allowed to self-pollinate, they will make identical copies. But because we mix the dwarf and the tall, these plants, when allowed to self-pollinate, which is what happened in Mendel's experiment, he crossed here and you got these offspring, they are not true breeding. Notice that 1/4 of the time they produced a short offspring, an offspring not identical to them. Okay, so why did the recessive allele seem to disappear in the F1 generation and then randomly reappear in the F2? It's a good question. So Mendel realized that organisms have 2 alleles for every trait. And these 2 alleles are inherited, one from each parent. If the offspring receives a dominant allele from one parent, that dominant trait will appear in the offspring. It'll be their phenotype. They will look like this dominant trait tells them to look. This dominant allele tells them to look. Recessive traits will only show up in the offspring if the offspring receives recessive alleles from each parent. So you need only 1 copy of the dominant allele to show the dominant trait, but you need 2 copies of the recessive allele to show the recessive trait. Catch you in the next one.